Jason Phillips had no intention of going to the abbey, but when young Arnsley discovered that he was an artist, he had to go. There was no getting out of it. He had protested mildly at first. He had still to finish the painting of the castle, and he had promised himself a few spare moments in which to ramble around the estate of Lord Leverage, Arnsley's father. But his objections were overruled by a wave of the hand, and consequently Phillips found himself on this October morning seated before his easel, staring miserably at the ruins of the abbey that had so caught young Arnsley's fancy. It was very old, and quite like many other abbeys that Phillips had had the pleasure of seeing. However, Phillips noticed at once that the building was fairly well preserved for its age, which Arnsley said dated back into the Roman invasion period, some said long before. The second and third floors of the building were almost gone, only a few supports projected into the air here and there. But the first floor, hidden for the most part by a dense growth of vines and bushes, was remarkably well preserved. Deep-set windows could be seen through the bushes, and over toward the cloister walk was a huge door which so engaged the artist's fancy that he decided to paint the abbey so as to feature the cloister walk in the door. Philip started his charcoal drawing. He made a few tentative strokes and erased them. After a moment of study, he repeated the process. There was something about the view of the cloister walk that escaped him. He leaned away from the canvas and regarded the abbey in silent irritation. He tried the charcoal drawing again with more precision this time. After a short time, he put down his charcoal. He did not seem to be able to sketch the abbey as he saw it. There was a feeling as of someone guiding the charcoal. Phillips felt vaguely and unreasonably ill at ease. It was due perhaps to the gruesome history of the abbey with which Arnsley had regaled him on the way up, added to his own previous knowledge. Of the actual building of the abbey, little seemed to be known. There was one date, the earliest, at 477 AD, which Lord Leverage had given out as the date the abbey was taken from the Celts by the Saxons. It was Lord Leverage's idea that the Celts had erected the abbey first as a temple of Druidic worship, and recent discoveries about the grounds had unearthed nothing to oppose the theory. Indeed, several of the leading authorities were in agreement with Lord Leverage, and in a subsequent history of the place, this point was emphasized beyond all proportions. There was then a gap of 300 years in the abbey's history. In 777 AD, the abbey appeared in contemporary histories once more. There was a curious story of the strange disappearance of a party of Danes who besieged the place, at the time still a temple. Phillips recalled that he had read of old-time bards who sang about this legend. This was perhaps the first of the incidents that gave the abbey a sinister reputation. Another occurred in 1537 during the time of Henry VIII, when the temple, then an abbey, was raided by a band of His Majesty's Reformation mercenaries. The abbey was at the time unoccupied, but strange, unaccountable rumors had reached from generation to generation, hinting at the awful things that happened there at the time of the raid. Arnsley recalled newspaper accounts of the dark people of the abbey, the ghosts of long-dead monks who marched forever along the cloister walk, telling their beads and reading their breviaries. The abbey had, in consequence, got a reputation of being haunted. There was, too, a story not so legendary that had happened only 4 years before. A fisherman had wandered into the abbey to sleep. It was common for these fisher folk to sleep in secluded places along the nearby coast where they plied their trade. The following morning, this man was found wandering in a dazed condition on the seacoast. At first he could say nothing, and later, when some semblance of speech had been restored, he mumbled incoherently about songs and prayers, and there had been something of green eyes watching him. 2 days after he had partly recovered, he disappeared. When a searching party had been sent out, he was found dead and horribly mangled in the abbey. Of the means by which he came by his death, nothing was subsequently discovered. There were curious marks on the man's body, deep claw-like tears in the flesh, and a ghastly whiteness led to the examination which showed that there was little blood in the body. The man had apparently bled profusely. But this rumination was taking time, and Philip, suddenly coming back to reality, reached quickly for his charcoal and again began his sketch, which seemed to go somewhat more easily this time. He had just completed his charcoal drawing when Arnsley appeared from inside the abbey and called to the artist to come in for a moment. With an annoyed smile, Phillips rose and made his way slowly through the bushes to the spot where Arnsley stood. Well, what is it? There was a petulant note of vexation in his voice which quite escaped Arnsley. I came across an inscription, old man, and I wonder if you could read it. It's Latin, I think, but so curiously wrought and so old that I'm not sure if I'm reading it rightly, though I seem to be able to make out the lettering. Oh, said Philip, somewhat nettled. Just follow me, said Arnsley. He turned and entered the abbey and progressed swiftly along the corridor parallel to the cloister walk. It's along in the corridor here. His voice came over his shoulder to Philip's, and he half turned to regard the artist in the subdued light of the corridor walk. Go on, said Phillips quickly, thinking of the charcoal drawing he was about to paint. Seems to be on some sort of slab, I should say, continued Arnsley as if he had not heard. And it's almost obliterated. You'd expect that, wouldn't you? He stopped suddenly. Here we are. Arnsley had come up before a rectangular slab of stone set as closely as the artist could determine directly in the center of the corridor. Phillips bent to peer at the inscription that Arnsley indicated with his cane. What is it? Asked Arnsley after a moment. It's Latin, of course, just as you thought. Well, that seems to indicate that this place has Roman beginnings after all, eh? Phillips grunted irritably. He remembered that despite the authorities, Arnsley had held to his belief regarding the abbey as a product of the Roman invasion. If this building was founded by the Romans of the first invasion, that inscription was put on a considerable time after. As nearly as I can make it out, it reads Quem petiverant, inventioned. And that, literally translated, is a quotation from the Christian Bible, those who seek shall find. Where did you get the idea that this place is Roman, Arnsley? Oh, I strike upon that as the best bet, said Arnsley, shrugging his shoulders. I'm told, though, that there's a priest over in Wallington who's got an old paper on the abbey, and he seems to think much as I do. I went over once to see his paper, but the old fellow wasn't at home, and his housekeeper was pretty chary about letting strangers mess about the priest's papers. The name's Richards, Father Richards. I've an idea you could get quite a bit of material from him if you want it. He's an authority on old abbeys and cathedrals. Phillips raised his eyebrows. Surely your father must have something on the abbey? Arnsley shook his head. Though he's custodian of the abbey for the government, he hasn't anything in his library pertaining to this place. Nor, curiously enough, has he ever cared to discuss the abbey with me. Off and on he's given me a few vague facts, but most of what I know I've picked up from hearing conversations with archaeologists who visit him. He clings pretty strongly to the druidic beginning of the place. But when I said something to him about it one day, he dismissed the subject pretty sharply. Also, he seems to believe that there's something pretty much wrong about this place. I dare say that grows out of an experience he had here himself. He was up and around this region hunting one day. Coming by here after dark, he swears he heard someone chanting here and saw in a yellowish-gray half-light a procession of black-cowled figures. He recalled that there were stories of the ghostly monks who haunted this place. None of us pays any attention to the story. His flask was perfectly empty when he reached home, and he can't usually carry that much in him. Phillips laughed cautiously. Arnsley looked down at the slab. Do you suppose it means anything? He asked. Perhaps it refers to some definite thing? It's quite probable that the monks had that inscription put there. You'll find others, I dare say, if you look. Arnsley looked at Phillips with a curious smile on his face. It's odd that you should think of that at once. I thought so too, and I took the trouble to look around before I called you. There aren't any other inscriptions. You see that this inscription is almost obliterated. Perhaps those others were not so fortunate, returned Phillips imperturbably, shrugging his shoulders and clumping out of the building to where his easel stood. Arnsley, however, remained behind. He sank to his knees and began to examine the slab in the most minute detail. Contrary to Phillips, he did not believe that the inscription had been put there merely as a matter of devotion, so that the monks who walked this path hour after hour in years long gone by, heads cast down, lips moving in silent prayer, should see as they passed this eternal word, and seeing, hope and seek to penetrate the veil. But nothing came of the scrutiny Arnsley gave the slab. He rose at last, and filled with a sudden hope, cast his eye about for a lost stone or an old worn bracket. He had suddenly conceived the idea that this slab might hide some secret passage long forgotten, probably even now impassable. A stone about 3 times the size of his clenched fist, almost hidden in the semi-darkness of the corridor, rewarded his search. Without hesitation, he seized it and began to pound upon the slab. After some moments, he stopped. The effort seemed quite futile. He thought he detected a hollow sound from beneath the slab, but he could not be sure. The difference that had caught his attention was at all events very slight. Then, too, he argued, the stone must be very thick, so thick that the pounding of this small instrument would not establish much. He stood up and dropped the stone, throwing it over toward the corridor wall. Through a cloister window he caught sight of Phillips industriously daubing his canvas. He began to wish that they had not planned to stay here during the night, so as to give the artist ample time to put the finishing touches to his picture the following day. If only Phillips had protested against carrying the blanket rolls. Arnsley could not explain his attitude. It was he in the first place who had suggested staying the night. It was perhaps the impending heaviness in the atmosphere that depressed him. So at least he concluded after looking at the ominous black clouds low on the horizon. With an impatient sigh, he went out and got the blanket rolls and the little kit of tools they had brought, and took them into the abbey. He deposited them in the corner of one of the most sheltered rooms. Then he came out toward Phillips, who had painted in his background, and was starting now on the cloister walk, which he could not do completely because the background might mix with its color at the edges. It was late afternoon before Phillips put aside the painting. Then Arnsley and he had a light lunch, after which they spent the remaining hour of daylight wandering about the abbey and the surrounding woodland. They had decided to retire early so that they could leave the abbey before noon of the following day. Consequently, there was still a faint red line on the western horizon when they disrobed and rolled themselves into their blankets. Although Arnsley fell asleep immediately, Phillips tossed restlessly about for almost an hour. He could not rid himself of an uneasy feeling of impending disaster, and fear crept upon him from the darkness of the starless night. He sank at last into a state of dream-haunted slumber. He dreamed of vast expanses of blackness where life crept about, shrouded forever in the darkness of the pit. He saw immense black landscapes where great gaunt figures of ancient Saxons, whose hard, cruel faces gleamed beneath their hoods, were arrayed like giant colossi. From the blackness a shape took form, a great gray stone building, crude as only the hands of far-past ancestors could make it. And there were rows upon rows of cowled figures marching in triumphant procession about the stone circle and away into the blackness of the sky. There was a huge stone pillar, from the flat top of which great streams of red ran into black maws open to receive it. There was a sudden flash of white, and Philip saw in his dream a great green thing, faint against the sky, that flailed the air with long red tentacles, suckers dripping blood and spattering it over the kneeling figures of supplicating worshippers. There was a haze again, that dropped like a velvet curtain, and again came the black ones, moving in and out among the worshippers, here and there signing to one to follow. Then this too was gone, covered with a great whiteness, like an impenetrable fog that swirled impotently about. He went tentatively forward, his hand tightly closed about the handle of the small hammer. He crept closer and closer to the opening. He was still horribly afraid, but he was possessed of an awful curiosity stimulated by his fear that drove him forward to the opening. Faintly now he could still hear the weird rhythmic walking sound, but it came from afar, and Phillips wondered whether it could not be the far-off beating of the sea waves against the rocky coast. Absorbed by the idea, he almost forgot Arnsley. Then suddenly recalling his companion, the artist called loudly, "Arnsley!" and again, "Arnsley!" But there was no response, and the silence became unbearable. He threw himself to the floor and bent his head to look into the black yawning chasm below the corridor's stone floor. What happened next remained very vague in Phillips's mind. He maintained that he saw nothing, but there was an awful, ghastly stench that met him full as he looked into the blackness. There came a sharp succession of faint screams and a low, horrible moaning that sent the artist stumbling and blinded out onto the highway, where he fell prone in the welcome glare of an oncoming Daimler. Phillips lay for weeks in a state of delirium. From scraps of mumblings that the artist gave issue to while delirious, investigators directed their search to the abbey on Lord Leveridge's estate. The inscribed slab was in its place, but by depression of a stone in the sill of one of the windows, the inscribed slab was forced upward. In a moldy crypt below, the barely recognizable body of Arnsley was found. There were peculiar marks all over the body, as if tiny suckers had attached themselves to its pores. He was devoid of blood, and most of the bones of his body were crushed. The coroner's inquest decided that he had met his death at the hands of persons or things unknown. The equipment found in the abbey, together with the artist's canvas, was returned to Phillips. Phillips hardly recognized the canvas as his work. It was 2 months before the artist, still weak, was released from the hospital. He immediately entrained from Manchester to Wallington to call upon Father Richards, from whom he hoped to gain some slight knowledge of the horror at the abbey. There was something about the painting, too, that Phillips had discovered after a close scrutiny. Phillips found the priest quite willing to talk, and the artist let him ramble on for some little time before he came to the canvas. He produced it suddenly and showed it to the priest, whose chubby face plainly showed his utter astonishment. "Why, my dear sir," he said in awe, casting a suspicious glance at the artist, "this is an almost perfect reproduction of a scene that you could never have seen. There is a reversal of the cloister walk and door. You have painted it as it was in the old temple, not as it is now, and there are 100 other odd details. The picture you have here is that of an old Britain Romanized temple to a strange pagan deity, the god of life, more often called the god of blood by the worshippers and present-day archaeologists. I have a picture of the god somewhere, one drawn from imagination, you understand. It makes me shudder. It's in color and shows the god with his black-robed attendants. The god is like a huge black-green jelly and seems equipped with minute suckers and tentacles, much like an octopus. It resembles a sea creature very much, giving off a blue-gray light and flaring a bright green from its eyes. Since the abbey is not far from the coast, there are many archaeologists who maintain that there was once an underground passage from the sea to the abbey, connecting, they say, to a crypt below the corridor. I don't know, of course. However, one thing puzzles me about the whole business. Did the Christians know of this devilish worship or not? If not, who then was it that put the Latin inscription on that slab in the corridor?